Welcome back to More Mileage from Your Garden. This is Chapter 3, all about wordplay and confidence. I'm coming to you from gardenatozz.org. I'm Janet Macunovich. Stephen Nicola, my partner, does all of the photographs without which we could not do these programs. And I'm speaking to you from the outline that you can get from our website. If you go to the About Us tab under Webinars and Conference Materials, you'll find it listed there, along with a number of other materials from various conferences that you can take a look at. And we're working on wordplay and confidence, starting with tulip, the varieties of the species, the genus Tulipa, which may or may not have come from the word that means turban, tolaban in Turkish. I'm not sure that I buy that one. I kind of think that it's one of those words that just comes. And I have to start this conversation with some observations about the Netherlands and the people that live in the Netherlands. I'm showing this to you. This is one of the polders, one of the chunks of land reclaimed from the sea and held back by dikes. And I'm showing it to you because I am impressed that in the Netherlands, when they do things, they do them on a large scale. We're looking at miles of land that had seawater on it at one point as seawater was pumped out over the top of what I'm standing on right now. That is a dike. And right on the other side of the dike, and just in case you can't tell, not very far downhill, ocean waves are rolling in, and below ground, below that level, is all of that land. They do things in a large way. It's Amsterdam, the city of bicycles, not just one bicycle, a million bicycles. And people who love their gardens, don't have very much room, have for many, many centuries been out of the land, but wherever they can put something that has flowers on it, they put flowers on their main waterways. And remember that they do other things in a big way. They have been the center of international commerce for many, many hundreds of years. On days when it is market day, barges pull up all along the canals, loaded with flowers, loaded with tulips, big tulip producer and tulip shipper, exporter, importer, and exporter. And that started a long time ago. These tulip bulbs showed up in the late 1500s, brought from Turkey and Iran, the old Persian Empire, to the court of the ambassador to the Holy Roman Empire from Turkey. And in that garden, in that place, they were a big secret. They were these beautiful plants that nobody else had in Europe, these lovely things. You weren't allowed to look at them, you weren't allowed to touch them, but within 75 years, they not only were all over Europe, but had been hybridized, incredibly hybridized, in 65 years to where they brought to the world a phenomenon you can see in the encyclopedias now in regular history books called tulipomania, where the speculation in tulip bulbs, in buying the next shipment of the next variety of tulip bulbs, because hundreds existed already in just that 75 years of people breeding them. People were speculating on the value of these tulip bulbs to such an extent that people were losing houses, shipments. It was the Great Depression in another form. In 1637, it crashed the European economic market to where there had to be legislation against speculation in tulip bulbs, tulipomania. That's how wonderful these were and how much they took the fantasy of people who really get into things in a big way. Now they've got a lifespan, tulip bulbs do. They are perennial. All of the species are perennial, and a few of them are not hardy to my area, to zone 5, but most are. And they live with their life cycle is a little different than some plants in that they bloom in the spring, do their photosynthesizing and storing up of carbohydrates early in the spring, and then by summer have gone dormant and need to sit dry and warm. They're from parts of the world that sit dry and warm, from the high deserts of Afghanistan, for instance. And while they're sitting there dry and warm, we call them dormant. They're not actually dormant. They're ticking off little chemical alarm clocks that say we need to sit for just this amount of time to finish doing what we're doing within the cells. And then in the fall, when the soil begins to cool down and become more moist, the plants begin to make roots. And they must make roots, most tulip bulbs, for 9 weeks at 40 degrees and below. If they're 40 degrees and below, they are stimulated to make roots, but not start top growth. If they get too warm in that period of time and they start top growth, they may do this thing that, that puzzles people. In Michigan, once in a while, we have an exceptionally warm winter. In the middle of winter, it'll get quite warm for several weeks. And if that happens, sometimes in the spring, the tulip bulbs come up and sit right at ground level with almost no stem, with a bloom on them. Or they come up and there's no bloom at all, just a bud that doesn't open called bud blast. And that's from not having the right situation that they evolved to live with. This is very common in the southern states of the United States. And so in the southern states, people are not able to grow tulips very well. So in many places, people say, oh, they're just annuals. Put them in, let them bloom, pull them out because they're not going to bloom well for you. I hear this from many experts. This is the water lily tulip. Tulipa kaufmanniana. Isn't it gorgeous? Opens like a water lily. A short tulip, an early blooming tulip. And for me, in Zone 5, a very reliable perennial. We have kaufmanniana tulips in our garden that are probably over 25 years old. And so we're not sure where that comes from. Some we know don't make it as well. This is Tulipa Badalini. Isn't it a gorgeous thing? Very early in with the crocuses, people say, what is that? And then they argue with you that it can't possibly be a tulip. That doesn't do as well for me. I believe that needs to have a much sharper drainage, much more mountainous kind of place. But the emperor tulips, this is one of the Darwin hybrids called Yellow Emperor. And Yellow Emperor has not only been in our garden for over 2 decades, but we have dug it out in a number of times, meaning to change our color scheme from yellow to other colors. And we obviously miss a few small bulbs because there they are back again. So for us, it's been a reliable perennial, but for other people, they say, oh, not so reliable. So it's a little controversial. There was a study done by by South Carolina's Extension Service looking at the perennialization of tulip bulbs. And they said that the Darwin hybrids, including these Yellow Emperors, and the Gregai hybrids are some of the best for being reliable perennials. For us, it means making sure that they do get a dry, warm rest in the summertime. And that means putting them deep in the ground, not up high where the annuals or other things that are growing in that area during the summer are getting watered all the time. So 9 weeks at 40 degrees or less. Red Emperor in with the Yellow Emperors. Now, the thing that tulips have said to me when I talk to them is, you know, we've got 100 different species, 10,000 varieties, all kinds of names. What the goofy English were doing during Victorian times when they believed in the language of flowers and sending people bouquets that had hidden messages by the way the flowers were arranged. People would make jokes. The Apricot Emperor is cozied up to Purple Prince. Both are in bed with Antoinette. Just silly things like that. We've done silly things like that as kind of an answer to what those plants have said to us. In one garden, we combined plants that had the name Confusa, Obtusa, Ambigua, and Depressus, a daisy-like flower that looks like that his second name is Depressus. Ambigua was a type of foxglove, as well as Confusa, a type of foxglove, and Obtusa, a type of fall cypress. We had them together because we thought that's kind of fun. Nobody else needs to know this, or it's a fodder for a garden sign that says, here's what's going on. We can put all these things together. We also have a name garden where we've collected plants that have the names of all the people in our family. We have a Diana, we have a John, we have a Richard, we have all of those things in the garden. Next plant is lupin. Lupinus polyphyllus, or many-leafed lupine, also sometimes called bluebonnet, but I think most of the time just called lupine. Named lupine for lupus, the wolf, because people used to think that like a ravaging wolf, the lupines would strip the area of fertility and would be the only thing growing there. It's not true. What's actually true is that they enrich the soil, but at any rate, that's why it was called lupin. And it is a plant that's part of our personal history. So many plants and so many gardens are. They talk to you of your own family, not just of who they are. This is Uncle Axel's lupin. Uncle Axel, Steve's great Uncle Axel, was a fisherman and an all-around worker in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. He worked in copper mine smelters. He fished for trout and sent them down to Chicago from Lake Superior. But he loved lupins. This man who built boat docks and worked in smelters and made his own cross-country skis, loved these plants and would collect them and grow them on the hillside. So we collected some of the seeds and brought them home. The plants themselves have a lot of great relations. There's 199 cousins in the genus Lupinus. Most of them are from the New World, from North and South America. Our native Lupinus perennis in Michigan is the host for the caterpillar of the Carner blue butterfly, which is endangered and is a precious thing to grow. There are many, many, many pea family plants, as well as many lupines. What's interesting to me is watching the leaves. Go talk to them in the morning and the leaves will be facing up at you. Go talk to them later in the day, the leaves will have rotated themselves following the sun. And with all of those different leaflets, they really can create great angles on them. Just beautiful foliage. We love our lupins. They, like many plants, come up with that color shift early in the year when they're cooler. They are a biennial, which means that one year they are just leaves, storing up energy, making the root large. And then the second year, they will create the flower stalk and bloom. Sometimes they'll live more than 2 years, especially if you keep deadheading them so that they cannot produce seed that year. They'll come back again, but we usually treat them as biennial. So that means that we put the seed in the garden the first year that we brought lupins home from Uncle Axel, and we watched for the seedlings, and they were just these, like this, the first year. The second year we had bloom, and we had a few seedlings from the seeds that had rested and not sprouted the first year. But by the third year, once our own blooming plants had dropped seed, we had seedlings all the time. So we always had some seedlings and some blooming, and have had that for 40 years and handed them down to others. They are members of the pea family, lupins, which means that they have a symbiotic relationship with its magical mic or mycorrhizae, these bacteria that live in the soil that can absorb gaseous nitrogen. So from the air, they can extract nitrogen. They're the only thing that can do this, that can take nitrogen out of the air. And once they take it out of the air, they give it to the plant. This is the 2 young Baptisia seedlings that I've pulled out. Baptisia is also in the pea family. And if you look on the roots, the nodules that you see, those there and here, those are extensions that the plant grew in response to bacteria having colonized that root, and they grew around it a little bit like oysters make a pearl around an irritating bit of sand. And within that area, the mycorrhizae are living. They put out through the walls of the root. They put out their fungal threads and draw in water and nutrients from all around in the soil. And the bacteria living in that colony live and die. And as they die, the nitrogen that they've taken in becomes available to the plant. This is part of the nitrogen cycle, how it gets to plants and it allows them to grow. And it is the only way that nitrogen gets from the air naturally into the soil and into plants. Up until the 1930s, the only place that nitrogen came from in the plants that we eat and depend on was from bacteria fixing it originally and giving it to the plants. In the 1930s, once people figured out how to make nitrogen from atmosphere, it was an offshoot of military technology. We began producing nitrogen fertilizers by running electricity, sparking electricity through air and pulling nitrogen out. And in the time since 1930 until now, we have more than doubled the amount of nitrogen in the soil system, in the plant system, in the world. So for billions of years, plants made nitrogen and we had X amount. And now in less than 100 years, mankind has made that same amount, has doubled the amount in the world. It's not a good thing. It is a good thing in terms of having a nitrogen source that we can use to grow food crops for an ever larger population, but it is not good for the water. We have an overload of nitrogen in the system. We have plants, we have sludge effect at the river mouths, at the deltas of major rivers, where things in the ocean and sea beyond the river are dead from too much nitrogen. So it's not necessarily a good thing, and we should be thankful to the plants that do it naturally. Lupine brought me into the story of ordinary Russell. The Russell hybrid lupins are probably the most famous lupins, beautiful plants, selected over a lifetime. Howard Russell was from in England, had a tiny cottage garden. So just like you see here, each of these allotments has its own little garden. Just a little backyard garden over a lifetime. He grew lupins. He looked at them and decided whether it had the qualities that he liked. If it didn't, if the flower was too washed out, if the stem was not nicely proportioned, if something else was wrong, he pulled it out. He let only the plants that he thought were perfect go to seed. And those were the plants that he grew in his garden. Which sounds an awful lot like what Uncle Axel did over his lifetime, except that Mr. Russell then introduced the seeds, or those seeds were taken from his garden, and now have become the Russell hybrids, all just from a lifetime, literally a lifetime, decades of selecting for the plants. It's made me feel a little bit, a little regretful, because we brought from Uncle Axel's seeds from his blue and dark purple lupins, which were, over his lifetime, what he favored, pulling out the ones that weren't the right color. And over our lifetime, my husband's and mine, we've let them go back to a lot of different colors, which we should probably not have done. Another thing that came from Mr. Russell is that people would ask for his, could we cut flowers from your garden? If they were asking for a funeral, he would say, no, flowers are for the living. And we think the same thing. We should probably follow his lead and the lead of botanical gardens. Put out a vase of what's blooming in your garden. Just set it out on the rocks at the end of your driveway or out in the garden on a stump. It says, what's blooming today? What it'll do is get other people interested in plants, give them the names of things that they can pursue, but it'll also give you the encouragement to go every day into your garden and get a cut from not just the lupin, but look, the coral bells are blooming. The perennial geranium is blooming. The pulmonaria has just gone by. The columbines are blooming. It's a wonderful thing to go out and see what riches you have, even if you have to be encouraged by a wolf lupine. That takes me next to little blue stem. Schizacarium scoparium. Don't even try to say the name. It comes from the same word that schizophrenia comes from, because it means that the awns, the parts that cover the seed on the little blue stem, are split like schizophrenia split. And it's got a number of names: broom, beardgrass, bunchgrass, but it's most often called little blue stem. And it is a plant of the prairies, native to the United States, native to all over the United States, east of the divide that goes between the short grass prairie, where it's drier out west, and the Great Plains area that's more moist. Everywhere from there to the Atlantic coast, little blue stem reigns. It doesn't live where the prairie mists are in the lowlands. It lives on the uplands. So when there's mist on the prairies, the upland waving grass that you see, quite blue-green early in the year from the blue at the base of the leaf, and then coppery colored like this later, that's a little blue stem. It's, 4 or 5 feet tall when it's in bloom, sometimes only 3 or 4 feet. Here, with one of our dogs bounding through the field trial area in one of our state parks, we're looking at a wonderfully restored area that used to have nothing but weed grasses and spotted knapweed, 2 terrible weeds. And over the course of 20 years of burning and seeding and moving things around, it's become more native. So that, do you see the gold and you see the glow? That, all of that orangey, coppery glow, that's little blue stem. And it's a wonderful grass for growing with other things because it's a bunch grass. It grows in a cluster, unlike some grasses that have runners that go out and take up lots of space, colonizing an area. It forms bunches, and between those bunches, there's room for purple coneflower and compass plant and prairie asters, and you name it, come up between things. It's a wonderful grass to have. And it's great in a year-round garden. I particularly love it in the winter. I can pick it out anywhere at 80 miles an hour, driving across an interstate freeway. We can pick out that copper glow that it has through the wintertime. And like many of the grasses, it stands up quite sturdy, quite rot resistant, which means that at its base, it's quite sheltered and warmer down near the ground. You know that at the base of a snowbank, so the snow piled up on the prairie, it can be 30 to 50 degrees warmer than the air above the snowbank. Well, in that area there where all those pockets of air are kept and snow might heap up, bumblebee queens that must spend the winter alive waiting to start a new colony the next year will shelter inside the base of a little blue stem. So a good idea to leave it up over the wintertime. Looking into little blue stem and talking to it about what it did led me to much greater respect for the soil through Professor John Weaver, who said, and he was a professor at the University of Nebraska from 1920, maybe 1918 through to 1950, and was a great researcher on the prairie. He said that the blue stems are the aristocrats of the prairie, holds the prairies against invasion by its dense aggregation into sod mats, and it appropriates most of all the water supply by virtue of its wonderfully efficient root system. Not much water gets past the blue stem. And one of the things that John Weaver was looking into was how long will the prairie last if we just keep letting animals graze on it? And he was looking at how many years of cutting it down and cutting it down and cutting it down before the blue stem can't regenerate and come back as a prairie. And he found that 2 or 3 year rotation was good, that you could let sheep or cows graze on it for a couple of years, but then move them elsewhere and let that area grow back again, preserve that native soil conserving prairie, because no wind can blow that soil away when it's being held so tightly by the roots. Here's a photograph of 1-year-old blue stem. It's in the middle, going by its old and easier botanical name of Andropogon scoparius. It's now Schizacarium scoparium. This is little blue stem. And this is 1 year's growth, 1 year plant. And this is 32 inches deep of roots. And those are roots as they grew, not rinsed out and hanging straight down. That is how they grew, straight down into the soil, harvesting water, even the water that slipped down to the 3-foot level or was coming up from the groundwater. Now these pictures, this one is from one of the many papers by John Weaver that's available on the University of Nebraska, Lincoln's website. Go to the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and search Weaver, and you'll find his papers, hundreds of them. These pictures that are in here, these drawings, are not artist concepts of the root system. These are maps of the root system. So we're looking at blue stem here. This one is blue stem compared to some of the others like June grass. And what John Weaver and his students did was they cut next to the plant and followed the roots. So they kept trenching and trenching and trenching until they came to the end of the roots. And then they drew the root system to show us how these plants actually grow. Isn't it beautiful? Isn't it gorgeous? This is a prairie aster and these markings are feet, with 8 feet deep of root system. Here's your little blue stem here with a 7-foot deep root system. And in this paper, they were looking at how long the roots lived. On average, it looked like roots lived for 3 to 4 years and then were replaced with other roots. So a very lasting root system, and a nice root system to put on top of things like septic fields. People worry about roots getting into septic fields, and yet you need the water to be taken out of the tiles so that more water can flow into a septic field. And what takes it out of the tiles is the absorption of roots. But you don't want the roots to be roots like woody roots that get bigger and bigger and more massive year by year and can infiltrate the tiles and then crack the tiles. You want something more like this. Here's a little blue stem that came to us in the mail right here. The little blue stem comes from the bluer color at the base of the stems here. This leaf still has its blue color, blue stem. And here it is out in the garden with another of our prairie natives, Penstemon digitalis, ready to take over, and I hope host our bumblebees and encourage other people to grow native plants, because they'll see it in the winter and say, what is that plant? What is that beautiful plant? Pasque flower will be our last flower that I'm talking to today. Its botanical name is Pulsatilla vulgaris. It's also called windflower and sometimes called prairie crocus. Pasque flower, Pulsatilla vulgaris, is a European Eurasian plant, whereas prairie crocus is, if you want to split hairs, is a native Pulsatilla, is a cousin that belongs in the prairies of United States and Canada. It used to be called anemone pulsatilla and has been divorced from the classic story of anemone, which is too bad, because anemone was a young girl who was loved by the wind god Zephyr, and a jealous goddess. Oh, this so often happened in mythology. A jealous goddess went after this terrible upstart of a mortal. And so the wind god turned anemone into a flower, which always responded to the wind, which always closed up and looked shyly pretty when the wind came by. And this is anemone pulsatilla. Blooms very early in the year before its leaves even unfurl. It opens these silky haired petals and calyx that cover the true flowers in here, offering it to bees and other pollinators. When it opens, and it opens often when there's still snow on the ground, there's a bee on it as soon as it's opened. The bees do love these flowers. There have been studies done by botanists and ecologists studying the temperature inside these flowers versus the temperature outside these flowers. And that cup facing as it does toward the light, and with all of its absorptive and space-filling, insulating stamens in there holding the pollen, is quite warm. It's sometimes 5, 6, 7, 8 degrees warmer than the outside. I like to think of that, and that why the bees are going to hide in there. And when that flower closes up, as it does at night to conserve energy, and as it does on cold days, inside there may be a bee resting and waiting for the warmer temperature. I like to think, though, not of the bees, but of those scientists who wired little tiny electrodes somehow inside these flowers to catch the temperature. Same plant after the frost is gone. These flowers were not hurt by the frost. They have already been partially pollinated and are not going to open all the way again. The leaves are just forming, parsley-like leaves that are going to grow up and form a very neat mound of foliage through the summer. Several different colors of Pulsatilla vulgaris: whites, pink, purple. This pink is called rubra for red, but really it's pink. Aren't they gorgeous? One of my favorite plants. Originally, I grew them from seed and still have the original plants. They're just beautiful plants. Even getting ragged here toward the end of their time, lots of the stamens have already given up their pollen. More are still there, and the center is forming its seeds already. Seeds which are, in their own right, gorgeous, like huge dandelion fluffs. Pretty, pretty, pretty things to have out there. And these fluffs sit above the foliage when it comes out and make a very pretty plant. Anemones, windflower, has taught me to trust myself more, and I hope it'll teach you to trust yourself more. Some of the experts that I turn to in learning about perennial plants say they are not long-lived plants. Oh, they're very short-lived plants, they say. And I looked and I talked to my plants. I said, you there, you're one of the original ones that I put out here. I think I moved you. I think I grew you from seed, grew you in one place for about 3 years, and then moved you out, right? Yes, I did. I moved you out here. And that was when Sonia was just a baby. So that's almost 40 years ago. I moved you out here and I split you. I remember I learned how to slice a taproot, and I sliced a piece off and I gave it to my sister. Are you still alive here, you short-lived perennial, just because I've managed to somehow put you in the perfect place? So I called my sister. I said, Kathy, those windflowers that I brought to your house, oh yeah, they're still here, she said. So every plant can do what it does on its own. leaves are still coming up. They're not up yet. These stems on the seeds will elongate and sit just above this foliage, which will also elongate and just look like a beautiful clump of parsley all through the summer. Beautiful, beautiful spring, long interest spring perennial to have. Needs to be in the sun, needs to be in well-drained soil. A new clump we moved to our grandkids' house. It's now 10 years old and doing just fine. So have confidence in yourself and certainly have confidence in the plants. Talk to them because they have something to tell us that they know better than we do. Well, that's as far as we can get today on Mileage from Your Garden. I'm really glad that you came and listened along with me to the things that my plants are saying. And I hope that you'll go out and ask some questions of your plants, of who they are and why they are, and then be able to extend your garden to even the non-gardeners in your circle, to the builders and the scientists and the home economists and the games players. They're all here in the plants, waiting for you to take advantage of them and get more mileage out of your garden. Thank you for being with me. Be careful, don't touch the leaves of those gunneras. They've got thorns on them. Gunnera is that plant. And that's it for Chapter 3 of More Mileage from Your Garden. I'm Janet Macunovich from gardenatozee.org. My husband, Stephen Nicola, is responsible for all these gorgeous pictures that you've been looking at it. And that's it for More Mileage from Your Garden. Come and see us sometime at gardenatozee.org. It's a labor of love where we put the things we've learned from the garden there for others to see, because people give back to us just like plants give back to us, and our knowledge increases and we try to share that with the world. Thank you very much.